Good evening, everyone. My name is Rachel Gilchrist. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Activism Manager for the ACLU of Washington. I'm honored to welcome you to the second event in a series of virtual conversations moderated by award-winning broadcast journalist Enrique Cerna titled Pandemics, COVID-19, Racism, and the Call to Action. This series will explore the racial disparities and inequities in Washington's public health, civics, and policing systems highlighted by COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement. Tonight's conversation will focus on how the right to vote and having one's voice heard is being impacted in Washington and how we can work to expand and protect that right. Tonight we are joined by the following co-hosting organizations: Fixed Democracy First, Highline Heritage Museum, King County TV, Museum of History and Industry, the Seattle Channel, Washington Conservation Voters, and the Washington Environmental Council. This program is being recorded and will be broadcast on King County TV, Seattle Channel, and the ACLU of Washington YouTube page later this week. We join you this evening from the occupied territory of the Coast Salish people. We remember that Indigenous people were lied to, treaties were broken, and their land was stolen. We recognize this to honor our truth and our commitment to fighting for justice for all. Acknowledgement is a critical and necessary step toward honoring Native communities and having a larger conversation on decolonization and reconciliation. Thank you for joining us. I'll now turn the microphone over to Enrique and our special guest, whom he will introduce.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us this evening for what I think will be an important and timely conversation about voting and voting security, how our voting systems are holding up during this time, particularly as we head to the general election. Early voting is underway across the nation, and here in Washington State, ballots have been mailed out. We know that people are filling them out and heading to the ballot drop boxes, which reports are showing that people are very actively involved in filling them up. So far, it's estimated that some 27 million votes have already been cast in early voting. But in the run-up to the general election, much has been made about the security of mail-in voting and questions just about voting in general. This evening, we're going to examine the security issues, accusations that have been made, misinformation, disinformation, efforts to suppress the vote, especially as it pertains to communities of color, and convicted felons re-entering society. We have a very good panel that is joining us this evening, and as I mention their names, I'll have them pop up on the screen and open up their microphones as well. With us is Jevin West. He is the director of the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. Jevin, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. Have a lot to talk about with you. Also with us is Lauren Baker. She is a former ACLU lead counsel on the Voting Rights Act case, Montez versus City of Yakima. She is currently special counsel for affirmative litigation and policy, King County Department of Public Defense. Thank you very much, Lauren, for being with us. We appreciate it. And also joining us is Christopher Poulos, an attorney and executive director of the Washington Statewide Reentry Council. Hello there, Christopher. Good to have you here. The council, by the way, was created by the state legislature in 2016 to improve public safety and outcomes for individuals re-entering the community, including having their opportunity to once again vote. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it so much. Well, Jevin, I'm going to begin with you. And I'm going to have each one of you kind of weigh in on your thoughts about voting in this election and the challenges that are being faced, but also our security of the voting system that we have and the questions that have been brought up. What do you see as the challenges? What do you see as hopeful? Go ahead, Jevin, you first.
Well, I'll start with the challenges and hopefully we'll end with the hopeful so we can have a little bit of a positive message, I think, at the end. There's a lot of concern about hacking on the technological side. And I sort of leave that to my colleagues in cybersecurity that are working hard on securing the vote from that angle. What we worry a lot about is the hacking of opinion through hacking of public opinion through various technological channels as well, and mediums of communication like social media, of course, and news online and offline. And one of the things that we've been examining in our Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington is the kind of disinformation and misinformation around the voting process in the election. And we've set up a new organization in collaboration with Stanford University where we're looking at primarily 4 kinds of disinformation. So we're looking at delegitimization, of course, that sort of overrides all of the kinds of disinformation, misinformation we're seeing. But we're also looking at participation interference, procedural interference, fraud, of course. And we're really literally working around the clock, and maybe we'll get into it later today, but there are all sorts of meta narratives that have really gotten a real stronghold. And every single day, and I would say almost every hour, there are stories and images and memes that are popping in to delegitimize that vote. And there are efforts among journalists, of course, but there's researchers, there's government agencies, and the technology industries themselves that are working together. So to start with, the negative part is that there is a lot of disinformation out there, and a lot of it's domestic when I compare it to the 2016. Doesn't mean there's not bad state actors. There are, but there's most of the efforts, at least that we've been examining, are domestic oriented, and so there's work. Good news, at least right now, is that we're seeing a lot of different stakeholders come together on this. So that's the good news among a lot of bad news.
Right. And we'll break this down as we continue our conversation here, because there's so much to break down. Laurent, give me your take on this as someone who's also worked at the local level, although the case that you handled in Yakima did have a federal ruling, but it's like that what happens locally really makes a huge difference. And in this case, particularly for voting.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the good news, which is here in Washington, we've been a mail-in vote state for quite a while. And so that provides us a number of protections that other jurisdictions across the country really don't have right now. We aren't looking at, any sort of attempts to, burden the right to vote through systemic changes to access to polling stations or long lines, things of that sort. So we have a lot of protections, but here we also have some issues. We have systemic problems with our electoral system that really impact communities of color ability to vote. You talked about the Yakima lawsuit, Montez versus the city of Yakima, and there was a companion lawsuit called against the city of Pasco. And those lawsuits were really targeted at challenging these sort of neutral election systems that we have here in Washington state and that exist in other jurisdictions that aren't on their face, aren't targeting communities of color, but the way that they play because of sort of racialized politics in a jurisdiction end up completely diluting and subjugating the vote of people of color. And in Yakima, as you said, we were successful in that lawsuit, and the Latino community there was ultimately able to elect 3 candidates of their choice to the city council system in the next election, which shows us that the way in which our elections are structured really do have a significant impact on communities of color ability to vote. There are a couple other issues that I think are really important here in Washington when we look at our election systems and how they impact communities of color. And we know that the criminal legal system targets historically Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, right? BIPOC communities have long been targeted and over-policed, and they're therefore subjecting Black and Indigenous people of color to heightened rates of incarceration and involvement in the criminal legal system. One of the issues that I've had the opportunity to work with at DPD is trying to find a way to increase opportunities for people who are incarcerated to vote. There are so many people who are incarcerated in our county jails that aren't serving a conviction for a felony, they're pretrial, and they should have the right to vote. But because we haven't figured out or prioritized structures by which we can ensure these people have access to the vote, we are thereby extinguishing the rights of people who are incarcerated to vote. And those are primarily low-income people and significantly people of color. Here in King County, there's about 1,300 people currently incarcerated. And about 80% of those, I believe, are pretrial, which isn't to say that all 80% of those have the right, but a large percentage of those would have the right to vote. And we need to find ways to ensure that those populations are able to engage in the vote. And the same is true, we have mail-in voting, but we have a significant population that's housing insecure. And we need to find better ways to ensure that those folks are able to actually access the vote. And those are the main ways that I find myself being really concerned about Washington's issues around accessing the vote.
Well, Chris, you have basically a lot in common with what Laurent has been talking about, because you had been in prison at one time, but then went on to become a lawyer. Quite a story, which we'll tell a little bit more about. But I know that this is a concern of yours for those who have served time to be able to have that opportunity to vote now.
Definitely. And first, just thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's an honor to be with all of you tonight. And please excuse if I'm moving around a little bit, because I have a 2-year-old German Shepherd who is still very much a puppy and was crying. So I do have to kind of switch from room to room to avoid her cries.
So we'll know now.
Me.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
Okay.
what's happening with my
right.
moving around and kind of franticness. So yeah, the backing way up, I mean, my personal experience, I was incarcerated in the federal system, and I'm originally from the state of Maine, which is one of 2 states where you can still vote while incarcerated. And that, even though I was basically shipped from Maine to first New Hampshire, then Brooklyn, New York, ultimately Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in central Pennsylvania is where I served most of my time. And so here I am, separated from society, separated from my community, separated from my family, and yet I was actually able to receive a ballot in the mail. And what that did was that put into perspective for me that I was still a citizen. I was still somehow part of the community, even though I was currently physically separated from it. And that actually was highly conducive to my own reentry, my own civic engagement in the future. And it really made the chances of me wanting to continue, not that I ever really wanted to do the things that wound me up in prison in the first place. That's a story for another day. Being able to vote while I was incarcerated posed absolutely zero public safety risk. There's no rationale to suspend voting rights while people are incarcerated or after incarceration, while reasonable restrictions on certain rights are understandable in a prison or jail. Voting isn't one of them. There's just no rationale for it. And being able to cast my ballot made me feel like I was still part of. And I'm happy to talk later when we have time about more of the policy issues about what's happening now in Washington and Florida, et cetera, around voting rights and as it relates to arrests and criminal convictions in prison too. But that was my personal experience.
I do want to mention here that to those folks that are joining us this evening, if you want to send us a question or a comment, you can do that through the Q&A dialogue box, and we will work that into the conversation as we go along here. But we definitely want your participation and to hear from you. Also want to note that earlier today, the not the state Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court actually rejected a Trump administration effort, or actually it was a Trump campaign effort to stop the extension of counting of mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. So that happened today. So the voting issue is very timely as we even talk to right now. So Jevin, let me go back to you. And well, first tell me a little bit about the center. I'd like to know more about that, but also tell me, let's talk about what's the difference between misinformation and disinformation, particularly when it comes to voting.
Well, let's start with definitions, because I think that's always important for at least us on campus. We're always quibbling over words and definitions. Right. The main difference between disinformation and misinformation is intention. So when we talk about it, and actually the public and policymakers, when they talk about it, they're fairly consistent with that now. When we talk about disinformation, we're talking about individuals and organizations that are intending to mislead, that push out campaigns that might have grains of truth, but are really out there to sow confusion, distrust, and really just to inject noise into our information systems and adding, a sort of information pollution. Our center was formed just last December. This was before the pandemic. We formed partly for these kinds of scenarios. Crisis events and major events like elections are times where there's a lot of uncertainty and collective anxiety. And I think we are at a level, if you could measure such a thing, and there are measures out there that scholars look to, that our country is going through right now. It's during these uncertain times where conspiracy theorists, professional conspiracy theorists, sweep on in and take advantage of those situations. That's when bad actors can sweep in and take advantage of those situations. And we're seeing it now. In fact, one of the things we're really concerned about is not just before the election. We are paying attention literally around the clock, but it's the day of the election. I think more people are becoming prepared for the fact that we may not know the answer on November 3rd. We likely will not know. And there could be these sort of shifts. Blue shifts are probably the more likelihood. There could be red shifts as well. These blue shifts, these shifts are when the day of has some result, and then as mail-in ballots come in, that shift. And that scares people, because where people will say, oh, it's it's being stolen from me, et cetera. And so these scenarios are already building up. And I mentioned in my first response, these large scale, these narratives, I'll give you an example. So one large narrative that we're seeing that's being fed with news literally every day is the mail dumping narrative or the mail harvesting narrative. And those narratives sit around, and then there are memes and images that will support those kinds of things. And what we need to do in journalism and in scholarship and others that report on these things is not just attack that piece of news, but also the narrative itself. And so that's one of the things, that's the kinds of things that we do in the center. But the center more generally is really a mixture of research, policy, and community engagement. That's why I'm here today, because it's a community engagement kind of thing. And that's one of our missions. It's to be specific, it's to combat strategic misinformation in society, to promote an informed society, and of course, to improve democratic discourse, which we've seen an erosion of over the last several years, and an erosion in trust more generally. So we're a center on a campus, but really we represent the entire community. And we were given funding by the Knight Foundation to start something that's never really existed on campus. It's kind of like a public health department, but a public information health department. We're there to think about cleaning up the information so that we can make good collective decisions. And we try to take we're as much nonpartisan as you can on a center. But this election and the pandemic is exactly the kinds of things that we're really working on from a research angle and a community engagement angle. And the election in particular is one where there's this confluence of all these other events. A lot of the things that we're seeing in the pandemic world, in terms of the rise of like QAnon, for example, these conspiracy theory groups, they tie these events together. So they have their stories within the pandemic, and then they have their stories within the election. And so these things are reoccurring, and there are some regularities to these kinds of things. And so we're looking for them, and we're doing our very best to try to put out information about election disinformation before it spreads too far. Because most of what we do in research, we spend 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 10 years working out problems, but it's changing the way we do research. To do that now, we have to report it. And if we have time, I'll give you some examples that we found literally today, so to watch out for. So these are the kinds of things we're doing in the center right now.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. Quick question. Are we really talking about what's being generated online for the most part?
That's a great question. We do most of our work online and on social media, but what we're finding more and more is the permeability between different kinds of media and the things that happen in the physical world. So one example is the permeability between the talking heads of our hyperpartisan news environment online and then what happens on social media. We've reported on a few specific research projects and findings where basically there's an amplification by these talking heads that pulls the conversation from Twitter into these these shows on these cable news stations, but then they feed back into the conversations on social media, and it has this feedback loop. And to get to your point, Enrique, what happens is it doesn't just happen online, it manifests itself in the physical world. So QAnon, who I've mentioned several times, I wish I wouldn't have to mention QAnon. It's one of those real unfortunate, surprising events that I wouldn't have predicted when it started in 2017, when we were tracking this sort of thing. Those individuals are showing up in protest with QAnon shirts and QAnon flags, and not just in the United States. In over 70 countries now, over 70 countries have now reported in-person events with QAnon sympathizers. And for those that aren't familiar with QAnon, QAnon is a conspiracy theory group that believes that there's a cabal, Illuminati, pedophiles and Satan worshipers that are from Hollywood and political circles that are running the world, and that there's different incarnations of it that they're there to try to stop that. And the unfortunate thing there is not just its base philosophy, but also that it takes away from the actual efforts. So as an example, they hijacked the Save the Children hashtag not long ago. And that took away attention from real organizations that are looking at human trafficking, in addition to all the other things that are problematic with that group.
Right. Laurent, let's go to you. It's said that, I think this is how the phrase goes. What is it? All politics are local. And in the case of, if we look back at Yakima, and I think we could maybe draw this out and look at kind of the impact on other communities. When it comes to voting, that one of the things happened over there was that for many years, and it was mainly the Latino community in Yakima, that at this point is close to 50% over there. I think about 45, 47%. It didn't have a voice in local elections. And a lot of that had to do with the way the structure of the kind of the district, or there weren't districts, it was kind of an at-large system. But this isn't not a unusual type of thing, am I correct? In a lot of communities around the country where this issue then disenfranchises communities of color?
That's right. So that the Montez versus City of Yakima case was really an attempt to ensure that the Latino population there had meaningful access to representation on the city council, because our local governments play such a critical key in our quality of life and in the way in which we live on a day-to-day basis. In Yakima, when we brought the lawsuit, the Latino population was just under 40%, but they had never been able to elect a Latino candidate of choice to the city council. And what that meant is in Yakima, the city is very segregated. The eastern part of the city is heavily Latino and the western is heavily white. And you could see municipal investment change from the east side to the west side. You would see parks that had broken playground equipment, pools that were closed, streets with no lights. In the east side, very neglected area. And as you moved west to the more white part of town, you would see municipal investment in programs that serve that population increase. So you had a population that really, was paying taxes, was really at the mercy of local government, but had no say in it at all. And so the lawsuit was meant to change the at-large election system, which means that everyone in that jurisdiction voted on each and every person who was elected to the city council. And in a place where you have sort of racialized polarities in how population vote, the majority population will always get their candidate of choice. And so in Yakima, that meant that the white population was always able to elect their candidates to every seat on the city council. And we sued to create districts because, municipal governance is important because that's what governs your life, but being able to have someone who lives in your district, who's really, experiencing the same issues that you are, on a daily basis and who you can walk over to their house or drive over to the house very quickly is important when you're trying to have your interests of your neighborhood, your community, your family represented in municipal governance. And we brought that under the Federal Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which is the way in which voter suppression challenges are brought even now. And we were successful. And as I said before, 3 Latinas were elected to the city council. And challenging election systems like that, these sort of facially neutral systems that act in a way that dilute, minority populations or community color populations' ability to have someone on the council couldn't be more important than in a pandemic. We're seeing now with incredible cuts to local government funding and budgets, the priorities that our local governments are putting into place, will have really significant impacts on low-income communities and communities of color. And so being able to have a voice on these city councils or even on county councils is critically important. And so being able to challenge these systems, we changed Yakima's election system and Pasco's election system, but there are many other jurisdictions across Washington that have really serious problems in the same way when it comes to the vote dilution. I think there's currently a lawsuit pending for the Yakima County commissioners for the same reason, because the Latino population across the county can't elect people onto the commission to represent their interest. But in this moment, I think with the Black Lives Matters moment and the long simmering sort of silent pandemic of police violence against Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we're also seeing a much more engaged population around our local governance and people wanting to ensure that there are elected officials who are, 1, holding law enforcement accountable, and 2, using financial resources in a way that promote real safety. And so we need to have election systems that allow these populations to meaningfully engage in the vote. And I think in this moment, we're seeing people who are concerned about their health from the COVID-19 scare and their health, and because of historic institutionalized racism that manifests in police violence at times. And I'm heartened by the amount of growth in participation in our local government processes. And I think we need to make sure that the jurisdictions that still have at-large systems that dilute the vote of communities of color make the changes that they can make voluntarily under the Washington Voting Rights Act.
Well, Christopher, let me come over to you now and talk a bit more about, first of all, tell us about the council and its existence, how it came to be, and why it's important.
Sure. So the Statewide Reentry Council was actually created by the state legislature about 4 years ago. And we're tasked with advising the governor and the state legislature on reentry. So what is working in the state around reentry, what is not working around reentry, and what can be improved. So that's our main task is. So we're really involved with legislation. We're able to support actual bills, which is nice. So I work for the state government, but do have some degree of autonomy as a council to be able to actually pursue policy objectives, even if they're not necessarily within the governor's top priorities or something like that, which is great. And more recently, I know this isn't the topic tonight, but we've taken a much more active role in actually connecting government and community organizations and boosting the ability of community providers to actually have ownership over the reentry process rather than hoping and waiting for state agencies to basically do everything related to reentry. And we found that that's a great way to do it. So the way we've been doing that is real simple, is reallocating funding from the Reentry Council's very small operating budget directly to community organizations across the state to get people into housing who are being released from incarceration during COVID-19. And so that's, again, not the topic for tonight, but that's one way that we've kind of shifted from working at the legislative and executive level to actually making sure that when people leave jail or prison, they have a place to stay, they have a way to communicate, they have a way to get around. And all the other stuff is wonderful, but if you don't know where you're going to sleep that night,
Yeah.
it's incredibly difficult to successfully reenter.
Well, this is an issue that we will be discussing in an upcoming virtual conversation. So we'll probably have you back for that.
Right.
Back to the issue at hand. Your background. You were incarcerated. I believe you had drug and alcohol problems. You spent time in prison. You talked about how voting or having that ability to do that was a kind of a lifeline for you. So give me an idea for someone that is incarcerated, what the ability to vote is that important to them?
Well, it probably depends on the person. I'd love to say everyone is thinking about voting while they're in prisons. Not everyone is going to be focused on voting specifically, but what it would do, and most people who are incarcerated cannot vote. The overwhelming majority of people cannot vote. But what it does is it presents the opportunity for a person to still feel like they're part of community, and they have not lost their actual citizenship, even though their physical freedom is temporarily substantially restrained. So I think that's the most important thing when it comes to voting, is that it is. And there was a question about whether voting is a right or a privilege, and is it in the Constitution? Where is it? I will let a more seasoned attorney on this call, or somebody, dive into the details of that rather than me. But for me, it's really simple, that the more we can keep people connected to community, the better the reentry outcomes will be. And then more fundamentally, and this is something for, I think, really pertinent to an ACLU audience, is how, to me, it's terrifying that if you can get someone convicted of something, somehow they then lose their say, their most fundamental say in the political process. And if we look at history and how most of these voting conviction-based anti-voting laws or voting prohibitions came about, for the most part, or at least became widespread and enforced, was after the Civil War and after the Emancipation and during Jim Crow era, is when a lot of this really became focused and happening. So to me, it's terrifying to think that if you're the opposition, for whatever that may be, is convicted of something, then they can no longer oppose with their vote. And that's a whole nother layer that I don't think is talked about much, but I think it's really pertinent to the ACLU.
Yeah.
In
Laurent,
particular.
I want to go back to Laurent for a second here, and that is that what do you say to those people that say that, okay, once you're incarcerated, you shouldn't have a right to vote?
I think as Christopher noted, the idea of felon disenfranchisement is rooted in racist policies that were meant to exclude and keep Black people and people of color from voting. And so one, I don't think it should be perpetuated because it continues historical racialized policies in place and continues to disenfranchise communities of color. But two, we sentence people to jail, to prison, and they serve out their time. I'm not saying that that is a just way for us to administer, justice here in the United States. I think incarceration, we really need to rethink fundamentally incarceration, but we sentence people to a particular punishment, and that punishment needs to end at some point, right? People are incarcerated for the amount of time that they have been sentenced, and when they are released, they should automatically be allowed to return to full civic engagement. And these continued restrictions on their ability to meaningfully and fully participate as citizens, one, deprives our country and our communities of the voices of people who are, our neighbors, our family members, and it really sways the power in our communities to the hands of those who are already sort of the most enfranchised, by keeping people who've been involved in a criminal legal system that has been found, our Supreme Court just recently acknowledged, to target Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Any sort of continued burden on the enfranchisement, the right to vote, will continue to keep those populations silent, marginalized, and continue this imbalance within our communities. So it really, here in Washington, we allow people who have felony convictions to vote. And so that, I think, is not as known as it should be. It's been that way for a number of years. It still hasn't made it into sort of the mainstream population. But just because you've been convicted of a felony doesn't mean that you can't vote in Washington. In fact, you probably can. You don't even need to have paid off your fines. You do need to be out from underneath DOC custody, but you have the right to vote. But we need to take that even further here in Washington state. Every person, I think people who are incarcerated should be allowed to vote while they're incarcerated. We should never strip people of their right to vote, people's ability to participate in determining who represents their communities, who make decisions about where their taxes goes, who makes decisions about how their families will be impacted for schools, parks, things of that sort. I mean, we can't really expect people who we've both taken away from, we've taken their freedom away, we've isolated them in really horrific settings, and then told them for a long period of time that they are not full citizens, that their voice doesn't matter, to come back into society and be able to, quickly be meaningful participants. And so the practice of felon disenfranchisement just needs to stop in general as a whole.
I want to come back to Jevin in that, as we talk about voting and mail-in voting, of course, we've heard a great deal from Donald Trump to really put a negative spin, particularly on mail-in voting, even though I think he did it in Florida. Probably will cast his ballot that way again, I think, this time around as well. But mail-in voting here has worked pretty well. But there has been so much of an effort to just tarnish mail-in voting, but just systems in general to keep people to suppress the vote. What are some of the things that you're finding that people are doing or outside forces are doing to try to suppress the vote?
So we see it at all levels. We see it certainly in our national media, on Twitter, on Facebook. We see it in sort of pseudo-local news. There's been several big reports that have come out about local news venues being essentially hijacked by political operatives, making it look as if it's a local newspaper, one that's recently gone bankrupt or closed, and using those as venues. I mean, you see it across all media channels. And what we're seeing at this particular time period, which again is different than in other time periods, is strategic amplification too. So it's not that it's organically happening. It's not that regular citizens by and large are concerned. There is concern there, but they're not amplifying it strategically, after, the second after something else from another influencer's, pushing something out. That's what we mean by strategic amp. You can see influencers on social media will time their posts and what they post in a way that sort of builds and really truly amplifies that content. So we see that kind of effort going on. And when we do see it, the examples that are used are typically misframed. So this might be, it might be an image of mail that's been dumped in the garbage, but it was an image that existed 10 years ago or in another election or even in another country. And so it's misframed or it's given misintent. So we see a lot of these examples where we'll see a post on social media where you'll see, maybe a mailman, it could be a legitimate image, but they're very, very rare, by the way, that a mailman, or mail woman puts it somewhere else, and they're labeled as a Democrat or a Republican. But we also see exaggeration, of course, is one of the big methods that's used all the time. And so we're seeing all these different ways, and they're repeatable. So we see these over and over. And after you've seen enough of these, you start to see these patterns. And around this narrative of harvesting and mail dumping, you also see this this ability with in coordination with lots of different groups, and we've done some posts. You're welcome to go read some of the posts where we've shown this coordination at all of these different levels to get these stories out and to discourage people from voting. But I should say that we also have to be careful within academia and in journalism not to, I don't know the right word, it's not necessarily over-report, but be careful not to over sell that maybe there's really long lines, because that may discourage voters too. So we have to be careful to not always report and sort of run to these reports of these incidents of failure, because there are some failure, and there's some of these that are synthetically amplified. But we have to be careful to also be reporting the 99% or whatever the percentage of all the votes that are done well. We need to build confidence in voters right now. So I guess one of the big messages we've been putting out for the last couple days and actually weeks is, and we're writing a post about this right now, is to make sure that when we talk about these things in public and on media and in social media, that we spend as much time talking about all the ways that the system does work. I mean, Washington State is a good example. Again, we all have these, there's all sorts of examples that people can cherry pick. But we want to make sure that we're out there showing all the ways in which it does work to build confidence rather than erode that confidence.
I've actually been quite heartened by seeing some of the early voting, even though there are long lines, what people are doing and willing to do, just to be able to cast their vote, to stand in line for as long as they're willing to do, or drive from another county, like in Texas, where they have limited the ballot boxes and things like that.
One ballot box for
right.
all of Houston. I mean,
right.
that's just ridiculous. Yeah.
Chris, you wanted to pop in and make a comment about kind of the what's happening nationally and things on voting.
Thank you. I did. And I also just jumping on what Jevin just said about the one ballot box. I know that's not my narrow focus of expertise, but talk about, voter suppression. That it's wonderful that we have these, people showing up in masses, perhaps as people maybe haven't in a long time. But the fact is that could be, if there were enough places for people to vote or drop their ballots or whatever it may be, people would not need to be waiting for so many hours in line. And of course that disparately impacts lower income people and people of color. And when you look at the neighborhoods where voting takes 10 minutes and neighborhoods and cities where voting takes hours and hours, it's often in inner cities and also lower income and high populations of people of color. So I just thought that I'm glad it came up at least briefly tonight, because that's a major ongoing issue that transcends my more narrow focus. So thank you. As for, I just wanted to comment real quick on kind of what is happening, current status regarding voting rights here in Washington, and then at least mention what's happening in Florida as well. So as LaRon pointed out, if you're off of supervision, you can vote in Washington, which is good. We're in a decent spot nationally compared to other states. But as of right now, if you're on community supervision, which can be for life, I don't know that a lot of people are aware that you can be out of prison in 2000 and be still on supervision in 2020, having lived in the community, not voting, paying taxes, having kids in school, whatever it may be, and be permanently disenfranchised or at least disenfranchised for many, many years as a result of that. So right now, current action is in the Senate and the House, bills led by Senator Patty Kuderer and Representative Dolan that would automatically immediately restore the vote for people as long as they're not actually in prison isn't. And so that's hopefully going to make it across the finish line this upcoming session. I know at least a couple people from the Washington Voting Rights Coalition are on the chat or in the participants tonight, so I would feel amiss if I didn't mention specifically the work that that group is doing. And then at other states, I'm sure most people listening today are familiar with Florida, which passed I don't know the exact citizens initiative or ballot referendum. I don't know the exact term. It might have even been an amendment to the Constitution. But they made it so you could vote if you were in, off of whatever it was, have a felony conviction. And then the legislature came back and said, not if you owe any kind of fines in Florida. And so essentially, Florida created a poll tax, which again disparately impacts people of color because of the conviction rates and prosecution and arrest rates against people of color. And so that's an ongoing struggle. It felt like such a huge win in Florida, and it is significant. But then this rule came into place where the person cannot have any court fines, fees, or restitutions. And people are stepping up from around the country and paying off fines, trying to do that. But of course, it's just a logistical nightmare because we're working with the clerks and trying to get each individual paid off. They don't even know how people. Sometimes the courts don't even know what is owed, let alone the individual. But nonetheless, the people of Florida spoke and said that people who have been released from incarceration should be able to vote, period. And then the legislature took it upon themselves to add these restrictions. So to me, this should be a bipartisan issue. It really isn't, but we're hoping that it gets there as far as conviction-based disenfranchisement and reenfranchisement. And we're hoping, very optimistic, that this year in Washington, we will get across the finish line with restoring the vote for people who are on community supervision.
Let me work in some comments here from folks that are watching tonight. This is a comment that says, earlier today on another Zoom talk, the speaker emphasized that voting is a right, not a privilege. Does this need to be expressed as a constitutional amendment or go state by state, or, and then they have a question mark. So what can I do to make the right to vote universal in the US? Who would like to pick that one up? Or all of you? Anybody? I'll move on if you don't want to do that. Okay. Here's another question. Has not allowing those who are incarcerated to vote always been a form of voter suppression? It seems that way when you look at this country's incarceration rate and who's being incarcerated, especially when many have lost their right to vote forever. Chris or Laurent, do you want to take that up, please?
Short answer, yes, it always has been a way. And like I mentioned earlier, those laws may have been on the books, but weren't really enforced, or they actually weren't even on the books at all until slavery ended, or at least what we classically in our history lessons look at as the term slavery, pre-Civil War. And so, yes, it's been an ongoing means of keeping power in the hands of white people, and particularly affluent white people and white men, for a very long time, and it continues to this day. I don't think the efforts of the legislature in Florida are anything but that. It's attempting to maintain the status quo even against the will of the people.
Right. Laurent, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, every citizen has the right to vote here in the United States. This, I guess, kind of dovetails with the question before. Universal right to vote is that's a little bit hard to answer, right? Because here in the United States, we have so many people with so many mixed citizenship status that I don't know if we are going to be able to reach universal right to vote. Like everyone over 18, regardless of their citizenship status, has the right to vote. We certainly in this particular moment aren't in a position for expanding the right to vote. We're in a position of right now trying to protect the right to vote for those who have it. And every citizen has the right to vote. But there are these limitations, these laws that have been created, like felon disenfranchisement, and most of those came, as we all know, after slavery and then during the Jim Crow period, and they were specifically meant to target and limit the ability of Black people and people of color from participating in electoral politics and being able to have their interest represented by political candidates. So yes, these restrictions on the vote are rooted and extensions of racist policies that have been around with our country for a very, very long time. And we need to do everything that we can to root them out, because we have seen over the decades what impact they have on communities of color, and what impact having elected officials who really aren't connected or don't care about particular populations, what impact that has on those populations, right? That is why we've had the war on drugs. That is why we've had long increased attacks on low income and communities of color, is because of these limitations on the right to vote for people of color and communities of color. Even if the restrictions aren't on their face targeting communities of color, the actual impact disproportionately burdens the rights of citizens of color, Black citizens, to vote. And it has really significant impacts on policies that are played out both locally and nationally.
Quickly, Christopher, I know that we're going to have to let you go here in a few minutes because you have another Zoom call right after us. But I wanted to know, when you were incarcerated, did the other inmates ever talk about, if you talked about voting, they'd say, well, we never, my father didn't vote, my mother never voted, so it was just kind of a natural thing that they might not vote? You need to unmute yourself.
There were certainly some people that had never voted. Maybe they had, it could have been generations that had never voted. But there was also people that for the first time while incarcerated, perhaps for the first time, got actually really involved in what's going on with the legislature, what's going on with the executive branch, what's going on with the law and the changing laws, because it was so pertinent to the people's futures. So what I saw is, even in cases where people, situations, not literal cases, but situations where people may not have voted in the past or not been exposed to voting in their household, actually did become involved due to the interest in, frankly, trying to overturn their own case and helping others as what we would call each other jailhouse lawyers. And then more broadly speaking to the topic, real quick on mass incarceration, I was reading, this was before the 13th movie and book and everything, by Michelle Alexander, when I was in prison. And I just happened to be reading the Constitution in prison, something we did. And I went to my friend Melvin, who's a Black man I was in prison with. And I said, Melvin, you won't believe this. This is like, we're basically still having to do slavery here. Like, what is going on? And this was like a revelation to me. And Melvin lovingly put his hand on my shoulder and patted me. And he said, this is nothing new. This is nothing new. It's just somehow some of y'all got caught up in it this time too. And that was a moment of realization for me. But both of us were aware enough to be able to become interested and engaged. And I had never really been interested and engaged myself prior to actually being impacted by the laws. So that's my experience. And I did see other men in Washington, particularly the Black Prisoners Caucus has been around for decades and highly active in what's going on in the state in legislation. And of course, voting is so fundamental to all of that. Great question. Thank you.
Christopher, I'm going to let you go because I know you have to go to your next session here, but thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, we just have a few minutes left here. Jevin, I want to go back to you, and that what should we be on the lookout here regarding, I guess, misinformation, disinformation, particularly in these last couple weeks before the general election date?
Well, I would say, working backwards from election day, I think election day itself is going to be one that we all need to be prepared for, likely because of the uncertainty and the collectively sort of riding through the country, and also because it's a time where we suspect there'll be a flood of disinformation. So I say certainly election day and after election day as well, to look out, to be especially vigilant during that particular time, and look to trusted news sources more than ever during those particular days. Prior to the election, we're seeing increased ramp up of disinformation. We're seeing a lot of repeats from 2016. I mean, as an example, we see an increase in the number of fake news stories coming out of Veles, Macedonia again. For those that don't familiar with that story, that was the fake news factory essentially that was creating news like, for example, that the Pope endorsed Trump, which was the most shared fake news story in 2016. That came out of Veles, Macedonia with some teenagers. Well, that factory is back, and they're producing a lot of fake news as well now too. But what's interesting is it's now being played out more on some of these new alternative social media platforms like Parler. Parler is this sort of alternative. It's kind of the political rights sort of equivalent to Twitter. So it doesn't have quite the restrictions, and you do see, this splintering of not only communities on social media around political issues, but even a splintering of the social media platforms themselves. I mean, we certainly see misinformation from both sides, and I would even I would say be careful though, especially during the day of the election. We are seeing a preponderance, of course, of the delegitimization, and that I would say, if you said Enrique, Jevin, you get one thing to tell people to look out for, is the delegitimization. It's a hard word, actually. Efforts that are going on from bottom down, from political leaders, and also in the social media sphere and in our news environments. And I think that one we need to push back on as citizens, and make sure, just know that it's coming, and it's coming full force. And so I think that's the biggest thing to look out for, and the kinds of news that feed into that particular narrative.
Laurent, I'd like to give you a final word about tonight, and also, I guess, what you want to say about voting and suppression and concern and hope.
One, again, thank you for having me on tonight. I do want to, there's, I think, a question about signatures and when signatures should be accepted or rejected, and similarities. And I just want to touch on that just because I've worked on that issue before in a really hotly contested election in Eastern Washington. And I think the question that we should be really focusing on there is not necessarily how similar the signatures are, but the opportunity and notice that a voter has to cure any concerns that their signature may not have been right, or they may not be the right voter, right? What we need to do is build in as many protections at every level to ensure that each and every vote that's cast has the opportunity to be counted and is not at any risk of being rejected improperly. And so I think it's less about comparing the signatures, although we need to do that, and more about ensuring that there's due process, notice, and an opportunity for that voter to be able to come in and say, like, no, that is my ballot, because each and every ballot is critical and important and must be ensured to be counted, and our procedures need to be strong enough for that. I think going into this next election, we, at the national level, there's that. And then locally, we have an opportunity, as we have with every election, to elect people whose philosophies are in line with ours. And in this moment, when we have these critical questions about, restructuring our law enforcement agencies and our policing agencies, when we're looking at defunding, when we're talking about institutionalized racism that targets BIPOC people, and how we change these, we need to make sure that we elect people who are in line with our positions on those issues, and that we hold them accountable at the ballot box, and then also at city council meetings, at county council meetings, and going forward. And so I'm hoping that from this last 2020, which has been quite a year, that we'll see sustained citizen engagement in local politics in a way that we haven't before, because I think a lot of people are recognizing, how important their local governance is to their daily lives and their safety.
Right. Thank you very much. I have two questions there. I know we're right at about 7:01 here, but and Jevin, I'm gonna, and if you want to weigh in as well, Laurent, you can do this too. But let me get in these two questions because I think they're important. One is that one writer says, "I'm not on social media. How can I counter reveal disinformation?"
Oh, that's a great question, because we typically assume that so many people are on social media, when in fact we know, because the studies have shown that more than 50% of U.S. citizens still get the majority of their news from TV news, from cable news. And so I think one of the best things that you can do to counter, if you're not on social media, and thank goodness to you for not, whoever the listener was and the questioner, to not be on social media.
Yeah.
I commend you. I try to do it more myself. And I should just turn the keys and throw them away. But I think the best things is to be talking within your community, to your neighbors. Those things matter. In fact, in-person, conversations still carry so much more value than the trolling conversations that we see on Twitter or Facebook. You can certainly write into your newspapers still. I mean, if they still are available in your local communities, that's, and be thankful if you can. I think you still can do things. You can talk to your family, friends, and neighbors, and I think that matters. And if you see things that don't seem right, if you get your news on television or in other forms, there are places you can go. If you see things suspicious, you can also email them to us at the Center for an Informed Public, and we can get them to the right people. So there definitely are things to do. And thanks for the question. And I also want to put this as a thank you to Enrique and for all those organizers on this. But you had one more question too, I think.
Yeah, well, this one I think I could even answer it. But is there anything I can do as an individual to help in the effort to deter or counteract voter suppression, misinformation, and delegitimization? You're right, that is hard to say, of this presidential election. And I guess all I would say is vote.
Yes,
Yeah.
I say vote. And we do have a specific thing you can do as a digital volunteer in our center. If you see things specifically around voter suppression, voter legitimization, election integrity, you can email our center, and we use those tips of things that you may have found on social media or the news or your newspaper or wherever you find, even in your email. You can send it, and then we put it into a queue where, if we haven't looked into it already, we put a team to investigate these things. And our team now consists of over 100 people devoted to this, working on this across these different organizations. It's a large group that works on this. And we take a lot of what we found are based on these tips. So you can go to cip.uw.edu. So it's the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington. And we do take in tips that people find around specifically voter integrity. So don't send us things, at least right now, about Trump saying this and Biden saying this. We're letting the fact checkers work on that. The political commentators work on that. We're working on issues of misinformation, disinformation around election integrity.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you both, Jevin and Laurent, and also Christopher as well, for taking the time to spend this past hour plus with me to have this conversation, which I think is very important. This year has been incredibly strange, but let's just do what we can. And again, let's all vote. That's the most important thing. Also want to thank our community partners for the presentation of this conversation. Fix Democracy First, Highline Heritage Museum, MOHI, the Museum of History and Industry, the Seattle Channel, and King County Television, which will also rebroadcast our conversation. Washington Conservation Voters, the Washington Environmental Council. Take care, everybody. Make sure that you're practicing social distancing, washing your hands, all of those good things, and of course, vote. And Allison, am I turning it over to you to have a final word here this evening?
No, we can send it right back to Rachel. Rachel, are you there?
There, okay. Well, let's go to Rachel. Rachel, are you giving us the final word?
Just thank you, Enrique, and thank you to our esteemed panelists for joining us tonight. I hope everyone has a safe and productive week, and get out there and vote. Thank you.
Vote. Good
There you
night.
go. Enrique's got the message. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you all.